Now I'd like to introduce Paul Champion, and Paul's going to give you an introduction to Peat Lakes in the Waikato.
Good evening everyone, it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's great to see lots of old mates that I've trudged around in wetlands with over the years. Okay, I'm talking about the deep, dark and mysterious places, and you know, as was said earlier, they're not always that deep or dark, but they're certainly mysterious. You know, there's a lot of great values in these wetlands. So what I'm going to talk about is, okay, where are they? There's been some great introduction about this. Where did they come from? You know, why are they there? Why are they unique? The conservation values, the threats and degradation that have happened over the last 50 or so years, and finally talk about restoration and the way forward. Okay, so the lakes themselves, there are around 30 of them, and as you can see, they're all scattered around Hamilton, and most of them are visible from local roads, which are high points that you can look at and see these. Many of them are administered by Department of Conservation, and as we discussed a bit earlier, Waikato District have certainly got a lot of reserves in the areas too, and they're recognised as highly significant, and there are multi-agency efforts to manage and restore these. The first real work I did in these lakes was back in the late 80s, early 90s, and already then Waikato District had extensive plantings of wetland plants around the lakes, which was way ahead of its time. And now, of course, there's the Wetland Peat Lakes and Wetlands Accord and the National Wetland Trust coming on board, so you know, it's all great stuff happening. So how did they form? What you need to do is really go a little bit further south than here and look at what really was the generator of these wetlands, and that is this beautiful lake. And if you don't know, this is the largest volcano in the southern hemisphere, and it has exploded and created huge amounts of pumice and volcanic sands. There are some smaller volcanoes around there, like Rooker, and of course then you need a delivery mechanism, and of course the Waikato River does that. So from about 40,000 to 12,000 years ago, the Hamilton Basin, which is an area of about 80 kilometres by 40 kilometres, the Waikato River just sort of ran its course right over that area and dumped huge amounts of this volcanic deposit into this basin, up to 80 metres thick. And what that did was it blocked a lot of drainage channels, and this is where the peat lakes initially formed. They were dammed by all this deposit that the Waikato River had spread throughout the system. But from about 12,000 years ago, the Waikato River sat in the channel that it is in now, and what happened then was all this huge area, of course we were coming out of a glaciation then, so wetland vegetation was developing, and it was the perfect habitat for peat bogs to grow. And the New Zealand peat bogs, especially the Waikato peat bogs, are unique in that instead of sphagnum moss, which is all of the European peat bogs are made of sphagnum, the ones in the Waikato are made from these restiads, the jointed rushes. And you know, that already makes them unique. And these bogs expanded, and I'll show you a little bit in a minute of how that happens, but what happened, they spread out over that basin, and the poor little lakes got squashed, they got deeper, but also they got changed by the peat nature. Okay, this is a slide of Bev Clarkson's, and what you have here is the swamp with typical species like flax and ralpo. That was developing on the bare substrate, but then as the nutrient supplies dried up, you were changing more to a manuka and a balmia sedge fen by then, because a lot of the nutrient-rich water wasn't coming in, and then you're starting to get peat formation. As soon as you're getting peat formation, you're actually raising up the centre there. It's called a raised bog, and this is the habitat that the restiad species grow at. And if you look at The Kapuatai bog, which is the largest of these bogs left, is about an 8 metre difference in height between the middle of that bog and the surrounding land. So it's quite major, and the peat bogs sit in that area where they're squashed up against the hills. Okay, looking at the peat bog forming species, we've got Sporodontis, which Karen mentioned. It's only found on 3 places on the planet, and they're all in the Waikato. Sporodontis ferrugineus and also Empedisma, and that's showing the roots of the plant. And because all of the nutrients come from rainfall, the roots grow upwards. So really unique, and it also forms a really neat peat. So because there's not many nutrients, you just get this organic build-up, and that's what the peat's made of. Okay, this photo was taken yesterday. We like to keep things current. This is sphagnum peat, which forms the bogs elsewhere around the world, growing on the edge of Lake Serpentine south, and you've got an all manuka vegetation. Okay, so the peat bogs, huge peat bogs around Hamilton. It really is wetland central, or should I say it was wetland central. You've got Moana Tuatua, on the edge of that is where the Serpentine Lake is. You've got Rooker here, and you've got Kumakarau. So Moana Tuatua, Rooker here, we're about 10,000 hectares in extent. Kumakarau about 20. So Kapuatai and Whangamarino are still pretty well there. So when you said, Greg, that there's about 25% of the wetlands still in the Waikato, in Hamilton District, Hamilton Waikato District and Waipa District, you're talking less than 5% left. So if you look at where the peat lakes are, you can see they're actually squashed on the edges of those peat bogs, squashed up against the harder substrate, you know, where State Highway 3 is, for example. So, okay, you can think of a peat lake as a lake between a rock and a soggy place. They're unique to the Waikato, or are they? And the character is they're tea-stained, and it's humic acid, it's the peat that's actually giving them that tea-stained colour. And also they've got an acid character, and the pH is about 4.5 to 5.5, and if that doesn't mean anything to you, it's about the same pH as beer. And it looks quite similar. And there's a specialised biota that lives in there, and I won't talk about my past. Okay, not quite unique, but pretty much so. There's another Sporodontis species that lives on Chatham Island, Sporodontis traversii, and the bogs push water and impound water up against the sand ridges there. So this is Lake Kumutu, and I've been caught red-handed. That's the stain there, but the thing is you've got that colouring, but you can see the water's really clear. But the tea staining means that a lot of the peat lakes back in the time where the peat bogs were at their main extent wouldn't have supported aquatic growth because of plants, because the light wouldn't have penetrated in. Okay, this is yesterday again. It's Mary de Winton showing the peat stain in Serpentine South, I think that was. Okay, so as I said, there's a unique biota. You've got Fernbird and you've got 2 crake species here. These are the birds that you hear and don't see very often, so it's neat to see what's making those noises. And dabchick. And also on the margin of this lake here, you've got the swamp lady fern, which is a threatened species. This photo was actually taken in Northland, but you get both of those species in the Waikato, or at least they were there. And then look at the fish. The bottom species is the black mudfish, and that really specialises in peat and wetland areas, and it can tolerate the wetlands drying up for part of the year. They just bury into the mud, and they can survive that, and then come out when the water comes back. And on top there is the largest of the native galaxids, the whitebait, and this one is still relatively common in the peat lakes that the water feeds into the Waikato River. So, you know, it's an endangered species, in fact both of them are, but you know, this is really the right sort of habitat for them. And of course you've got some pretty big eels, because certainly in Serpentine there's not been a great deal of fishing, and it's good to see them there. And also on the edge there is one of the specialised submerged plants, the native bladderwood, and that is used to growing in poor nutrients. It's got little bladders on the plant which actually trap submerged insects. It's a suction trap. So highly specialised plants. Okay, and certainly in 2005 we found the utricularia growing in that wetland area between the two basins of Lake Rotomanica. And as well as the big things you see, there's also the invertebrates, the sort of forgotten organisms that you get in these habitats. This thing here, nicknamed Fred the Thread, found by Kareem Watts at Langcare in Hamilton, only lives on the Sporodontis that's only found on 3 places on the planet. And you know, look at the caterpillar, look at the adaptation that that thing has. It's unbelievable, and you know, quite easily that thing could have been lost to science if you know, if the trend is to continue to lose these species. And you know, when Europeans started to move into the area, there was some wetland drainage and development of pasture, and the peat influence was lessened on these lakes. There was less staining, and aquatic plants, the native aquatic plants, could grow in the water there. Okay, this is the only bit of science I'll show you, which is one slide more than I normally show in my talks, but this looks at the pH, the acidity of Lake Maritoto, which has got the most character of the old peat lakes of any of the lakes within the Hamilton region. And you can see there's some work done there by Jacques Roubaix in the late 1970s looking at the pH. It was certainly down to almost 4 and up to just above 5.5, so that's really within that range, as I say, of pH that you'd expect from a peat-influenced lake. But then you're looking at the more recent data from Environment Waikato, and you're seeing that the pH is sort of increased by a factor of 1 unit, which is a logarithmic scale, so it's actually 10 times less acid. So that's a pretty significant change, and all of the other peat lakes have changed more than that, and they're up in the 7s, which is sort of neutral water. Most lakes in New Zealand have a pH of about 6, 6.5, 7. In the early to mid 20th century, some of the shallow peat lakes were drained, and you see the Rotopico Lake, which was one lake then. This is quite an early map in the earliest part of the 20th century. There's the Round Lake, which has been drained and converted to pasture. And often the peat layer around these peat lakes is quite shallow compared to the main bog areas, and it was converted into pasture, and very, very productive. And you know, that's progress. We've got to make a living. So you know, a lot of the edges of the bogs were drained, but the main bogs weren't drained until after World War II to any great extent. And here's a map that our librarian found in the Hamilton Library, and you can see there's a big area of Moana Tuatua peat bog there. You've got Rooker here up in the top there, and Maritoto sitting within that peat bog. And good old Google Earth, thank goodness for it. Okay, that little postage stamp there is all that's left of the Moana Tuatua peat bog. Actually, it looks more like a little meat cleaver, which is what's happened to a lot of our peatlands. It's now 90 hectares, it used to be 8,500 hectares. And the Rooker bog, which is up in the top left there, there's even less of that left.